Hi, I'm Koresh Ali Lonson, a host of Changing the Narrative and director of the Center for Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation at OSU-Tulsa. This month, we wanted to highlight a conversation we had last year, just 2 weeks before the centennial of the Tulsa Race Massacre, about a difficult but important subject: how to talk to children about trauma. This episode focuses on the trauma of the Tulsa Race Massacre and the pandemic, but the points, insights, and advice found in this conversation can apply to many of the difficult situations we find ourselves needing to explain to our children. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Changing the Narrative, the May edition, produced by OSU-Tulsa. OSU-Tulsa Center for Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation, the Center for Poets and Writers at OSU-Tulsa, and Tri-City Collective. My name is Koresh Ali Lonson. I'm the director of the Center for Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation, and a member of Tri-City Collective. And we are happy that you're here. We're going to have a very engaging conversation about a very difficult, often difficult topic, which is discussing trauma with children, and trauma and how trauma and different forms of trauma affect children, specifically in this conversation as it relates to the history of the Tulsa Race Massacre. As all of you know, the centennial of the massacres in 2 weeks, and also the trauma of the pandemic, of the year that we have lived through, are living through, and how this year has really changed our lives, and certainly the lives of our children, I think, indelibly, for quite some time, from many different aspects of life. And I'm looking forward to sort of diving into ways to address the ways in which these traumas have affected our youngsters. And I just want to put out a disclaimer that parts of this conversation might not be suitable for young children to listen, not because anyone's going to say anything extraordinarily, profane, but because of the subject matter itself is quite heavy and can be triggering for some. So just wanted to put that out there to keep that in mind if your children are nearby. So let me introduce our two guests, which I'm very happy to share this platform with whom I'm very happy to share this platform. Chantel Lott is the prevention coordinator at the OSU Center for Family Resilience. She joined the center in 2014 and has been involved in work surrounding teacher support, youth self-regulation, adolescent growth mindset, and other community outreach initiatives. Her work is focused on ensuring children have the tools and resources they need to overcome their traumatic experiences. Her work as a PAX partner, which, what does PAX mean, Chantel? PAX?
Yeah.
It just means PAX?
Peace, productivity, health, and happiness.
Okay, thank you. A PAX partner allows her to work with schools to provide trauma-informed strategies in the classroom. She also is the coordinator for the United We Can program, which focuses on college and career readiness for middle school youth. She has a BA in psychology and an MS in teaching, learning, and leadership. And then and I'm gonna get this right, Dr. Jyotsna Sharma. Was I close? Jyotsna. Like, why did I put the emphasis on the dip? I mean, I flipped the diphthong. People flip the diphthong in my name all the time, this thing with diphthongs, yo. Anyway, Dr. Sharma is an assistant professor at Oklahoma State University in the Department of Counseling Psychology. She graduated in 2019 from Virginia Tech with a PhD in counselor education. Her research is focused on exploring sociocultural contexts and their effect on trauma recovery and post-trauma growth, specifically in the context of interpersonal violence. Her lab, the OSU Trauma Recovery and Growth Lab, explores patterns of trauma recovery, and post-trauma growth in the context of socio-cultural intersectionalities, which is something I want to dig into a little bit in this conversation. She's also involved in research and advocacy related to equity and access of mental health services for underserved populations, and is passionate about developing and applying educational practices that help develop culturally sensitive counselors. which are much needed. Dr. Sharma is a licensed clinical mental health counselor in the state of New Hampshire, a national certified counselor, and an approved clinical supervisor through NBCC. Her experience includes working with children, adolescents, and young adults struggling with trauma, anxiety, depression, mood orders, Asperger's, autism spectrum, as well as perpetrators of sexual violence. So, Dr. Sharma, Ms. Chantel, Ms. Lott, welcome to Changing the Narrative, our final for this year, for this academic year, and we will start up again probably in September with new topics and new conversations. So, but thank you all for joining us for this conversation. So I want to begin with, I really want to begin with the pandemic and then get to the massacre. As I mentioned earlier before we jumped to live, that Pastor Tim Newton, who runs Drexel Academy, who runs the Dream Center, in North Tulsa, is a good friend, and we interviewed him for our radio show Focus Black Oklahoma, which airs on KOSU, as a part of a 3-part series on COVID in North Tulsa. The series was called Black Plague and was specifically about the ways in which the pandemic and responses to the pandemic, either from officials, medical officials, government officials, as well as folks living in North Tulsa, their responses, and how COVID affected their lives and in many ways changed their lives. As you both know, people of color in particular are Indigenous American folks, families, Latinx folks, and Black Americans were the populations that are suffering, continue to suffer the most, were hit hardest by the coronavirus. And Pastor Tim said something to me that, or something in the interview that continues to resound or resonate with me, that I'd like to sort of get your takes on. He said that he experienced young people as young as 8 years of age coming to the Dream Center, talking of depression, talking of suicide, talking of the effects of social isolation, the lack of ability or commitment or even desire to actually pay attention to remote learning, which was a whole nother kind of thing to begin with anyway, particularly in neighborhoods and communities like North Tulsa. And so I want to get your 2 senses on, like, it's a big question, but what do you think the effects of the pandemic have been on our young people all over the country, but certainly in Tulsa? And how do you think what do we need to do to address that trauma? Anyone want to go first, or do I pick a name? Okay, Chantel, go.
So yeah, I work with youth, middle school youth, and the engagement definitely is not there. And we know that one of the signs of depression is lack of interest in the things you typically like to enjoy doing. So we try to provide even virtual meetups for students, and sometimes that went well and sometimes it didn't. But in thinking about children as young as 8, in my work with PACS, we were doing some PACS tools as another community component of it. And I was speaking with an adult who works with children, and I didn't ask the age at the time, but she was explaining this lack of motivation, child not doing anything. And I'm thinking she's thinking of a teenager, and she told me it was a 2nd grader. And so it definitely it's definitely impacting our younger kids. I have young children of my own, and when they are out of their element, they're not consistent in a stable environment, it's not consistent, that throws them off, because we all thrive on consistency and routine, but especially kids, they're seeking that. They need that structure. So when it's not there, it definitely throws their world upside down. And if they don't have the tools or the coping mechanisms to handle the different changes, transitions going on, especially if it's a lot, and there was a lot going on throughout this pandemic, that can definitely throw everything out, and they don't know how to respond or deal with their emotions.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think there's been a lot of grief, and there's been a lot of loss, not just within family systems, in the people losing people within their family systems, but also loss of like connection, loss of people who they look up to, people who they trust, their teachers, their administrators, their friends, people who they sit next to. Kids don't have that anymore. Teenagers may be faring a little bit better, or maybe also a little bit worse due to social media, because there is a lot of pros and cons to using social media as well. So children specifically, there is a lot of exhaustion and a lot of grief and loss that they don't know how to deal with, because it's at so young an age, you normally developmentally don't know or have not learned how to handle that grief of losing relationships for no fault of your own. You know, normally when we lose relationships, it's about moving away, it's about someone leaving the school, it's about having a fight with someone. In this situation, specifically with the pandemic, none of that is present, you know? So it's really weird for people to make sense, or especially kids to make sense of the fact that this thing was here today and yesterday, and now it's not here today. And how am I supposed to deal with this? And because of the fact that adults are also dealing with the same kind of transition, the same kind of grief and the same kind of loss, they are not, or sometimes forget to concentrate on the fact that our kids are dealing with the same thing. So how do we talk about these emotions, and how do we mention this, and how do we teach them how to deal with what they're going through? So it definitely is there. Yeah, there's a lot of grief and loss, and I completely agree with the lack of motivation, because we are going through a pandemic, and how is learning or academia at this point for kids, if you think with a kid's mind, a child's mind, is like, how is passing my exam important when I'm in a pandemic? You know, so they don't understand it, they don't get it. And we being, socialized in a way as adults towards academic achievement, we are like, no, you have to do this, like you have to complete this stage, and we're kind of in that chaos of like, don't miss out. And the kids are like, oh, how does it really matter?
Oh, did you complete your thought, or did you just?
Yes, I did.
Okay. So, and then thinking about that in the context of communities like North Tulsa, which, or Northeast Oklahoma City, or West Tulsa, or East Tulsa, right? Communities that were already struggling with being a food desert, being over policed, lack of immediate access to health and medical care, right? And then you add in, and schools that are woefully underfunded. And then you throw in this pandemic in the mix, which adds a whole nother kind of element. I've been, as an educator, we're all educators, but thinking about what do you think we have to do as educators, as adults, as parents, to repair the damage? Is the damage irreparable? What do we need to put in place for this?
Know that it's going to take time, because this was trauma upon trauma, especially for certain people. You know, they were already experienced, like you mentioned before, certain traumas with food deserts. And I believe it was reported that, child abuse cases were down because no one's reporting child abuse. I know in certain areas throughout the country, domestic violence went up. And so, you have trauma upon trauma. So with that, as parents, as educators, as youth workers, also knowing when you need to get help too, because, I think about the oxygen first thing, save yourself first. But as adults, we could project our trauma onto other people, and our kids pick up on that too. So being mindful of when our trauma is being translated over to the kids. I think coming together with resources that are going to be adequately used by the community will be appropriate, and making it okay to go and get help. I mean, there's nothing wrong with it. There should be no stigma about going to get help. We were all in the same situation, so that puts us on the same playing field. So essentially, we all can ask for help when we need it. And thinking about kids, look out for certain behaviors, because try to pick up on it early. The earlier, the better. We talked about the 8-year-old. If there are certain behaviors, your child was not exhibiting prior to the pandemic, this is a sign that you need to go get some help. And there is nothing wrong with getting help.
Absolutely. I agree with all of that. And I would add to it that a lot of times as adults, what we do is because we're also with our kids, we're always in teaching mode with our kids as well as our students, right? As educators, a lot of times what we do is that we listen to respond, but we don't listen to understand. And I think providing that space for kids to be able to say, like, not necessarily like, here's how I'm going to respond, but making sure that your child has been able to complete their thought and sitting with that thought and being able to really understand what are they trying to say and what is the meaning of this, reaffirming what they mean. It's before you reply to them in any way, reaffirming, like, are you telling me that you're sad? Are you telling me that you feel frustrated? Are you telling me you're feeling angry? So trying to figure out what emotion is your child conveying to you before you respond to them, or before you say, oh, well, it's okay, just deal with it, take a deep breath, like all those things are great for when we're trying to respond and give them direction of how to problem solve. But some of this is not problem solving. Some of this is just providing a space for emotions to exist and to listen and understand those emotions and say, it's okay. It's okay that you're having this emotion. It's okay that you're angry. It's okay that you're lacking motivation. It's okay that you feel sad. I feel sad too. Sharing that, validating and affirming and sharing that emotion with your child or with your teen to be able to say, I get it. I totally get it because I'm going through the same thing too. Instead of using that top-down approach of, let me tell you what to do with it. Let's just sit with it for a little bit. And I know that this is really hard for adults to do because we're so busy and we have made ourselves so busy that we don't give ourselves permission to have that time to spend with kids to have that conversation. But I think it's really is important. And definitely do your own work, because like the comment on Facebook came up related to, people taking out their anger or their own emotions that they can't deal with onto vulnerable populations. That is real. That's a real thing. So we have to make sure that we protect our kids and teens for sure.
And as you were talking, I was thinking about something, one of my child that made me realize how I'm carrying the things that I'm going through or witnessing. Like, we say things as adults, not thinking the kids are in tune with what we're saying, but they are clearly listening and they truly do understand. So,
Absolutely.
One, if you're going to say things, be able to come back and have a conversation with your child and, tell the truth about it, because, like you said, I'm feeling sad, I'm feeling frustrated. It's okay to express yourself as an adult to the kids, because they need to hear it so that they know how to handle it in an appropriate manner as they grow and get older too. So.
Absolutely. And even on an umbrella level, like, anything that causes trauma, there is a lot of research out there that talks about the fact that when we repress our emotions, or when we don't talk about our emotion, when we shun our emotions, or when we don't let those emotions move through and process them, is what kind of then carries through and manifests in a way that can cause trauma in the future. Grief in the future, loss in the future, so in order to be proactive and be trauma informed, so that this effect, the after effect of this pandemic doesn't keep going on for 15, 25 years, what we need to do is be more mindful of how we're talking to our kids and teens, and how we're processing those emotions, and are we providing that space for those emotions to move through and get processed so that they don't manifest in a undesirable way in the future.
And I will add, I don't think it's, in my opinion, we don't have to start off something major, like magical. Like, it's not, some of this stuff is real basic. Like you mentioned, spending time and talking. Like, we don't always have to go to the extreme level. What are we going to do to save ourselves and save the world? Oftentimes we have gotten away as a society of socializing with each other in meaningful, engaging situations. So make time to do that. Play games, have conversations, have fun. Having fun can a lot of times take our minds off of what's going on in the world. Even if it's just a balloon fight, summer's coming up, color crayons, bring back the old school games, jump rope, hula hoop, do something fun. And that way, we're not always inundated are surrounded by what we consider the trauma.
Absolutely.
That's both great advice from both of you parents out there. I hope that you're taking notes. Hope you're paying attention to these very sound and simple, really, in many ways, sort of simple suggestions, but very impactful, right? Let me ask you both and I'll be very sort of specific in this regard, right? I mean, and I think Chantel, you mentioned this, that someone in the chat raised the point, and I think both of you did, that someone in the chat raised the point about taking their frustrations or their emotions out on vulnerable populations and increase in child abuse. And one of the stories in the series that we did on COVID in North Tulsa, we focused on mental health and domestic abuse, right? And that those numbers had risen in the pandemic as well. And so what would you say, what advice would you just gave great advice for parents in terms of working with their kids as well as also owning their stuff. But let's just be adult specific right now. What advice or suggestions would you give to parents to try and help them just sort of settle, right? And be more human in this moment where it's very challenging to be so?
That's a great question. I think that one of the things that I've realized through my research, or even just being curious about ways in which trauma travels through generations, a lot of it is what we pick up from different sociocultural contexts. It's like, our family system, our friends, our political, economic, educational institutions and things like that. I think that a lot of people during the pandemic or during the start of the pandemic were very concerned because they had too much time to spend with themselves and they didn't know what to do, what to do with it. I think timing is actually could be used in a sort of channeled way. I'm trying to be very intentional of not using words that might have like loaded positive or negative, meanings to it. So it's a good way to channel that energy to try to figure out, okay, what are things that are in my life or in my lifestyle? What are the things that are being useful to me, or what are the things that are helping me progress as a person or as a human being in life? And what are those things that are kind of getting in my way of being my sort of best self? A lot of times those things are traumas that we carry through generations, or patterns of behavior or attitude that we carry through generations that we have not realized are not serving us really well. So I think that this is a great time to kind of figure out, okay, what is it, when you want to end a vicious cycle of carrying trauma from one generation to the other, you need time to be able to figure out what is it that is serving you and what is it that is not. And this is a time to be able to do that. So to adults, I would say, like, take that time and don't be scared of it. And also give yourself that space to be able to process it. And if you don't know how to process it on your own, there are some very wonderful counselors out there that will help you do that. Counseling is not just for people who are struggling with handling things like depression or anxiety. It's also for people who want to progress as human beings. So taking that stigma away. I'm trying to take some of that stigma away. Is like, you don't come to a counselor or a psychologist or, a therapist only when you think that you have problematic behavior. You can also come just for your own development as a human being. So I think providing that space for yourself is really important to adults as well.
Agree 100% with everything. And there are ways even building up to that. If we're talking about adults and making time for ourselves and making sure that we can cope with the things that are around. Sunshine does wonders. I often came up for, it's sunny when it was sunny outside. People ask me how I'm feeling. Sunny outside, sunny heart. Get outside again and doing things that you enjoy. If you were working all the time and you were home with your kids, you do need time to yourself. So making that space is definitely important. And then also just recognizing when you are in a space where it's not healthy. And sometimes you may not recognize it, but you can at some point feel when things are not right. And it's okay when things are not right. Again, there are resources out there, seek the resources, but find something that's going to make it right in a healthy manner, of course. So.
Yeah, of course.
I mean,
Because there's definitely unhealthy ways of doing it. But like, we want to find ways in which you can do it in a healthy manner.
Absolutely. There are certainly plenty of unhealthy ways out there. I mean, to that end, right, I know that I personally, at the beginning of I'm somebody who works all the time. And like I've been in perpetual motion since I was a sophomore in college, which was decades ago in the 80s, right? I'm somebody who's always doing something, always working, maybe to my own detriment or to a fault. And the pandemic really shut me down early on. Like I couldn't do anything for a while, right? I felt completely overwhelmed and debilitated by the enormity and the weight of what was happening in the world and in the country and in our state and our city. And then I slowly started writing poems because that's a part of what I do. I'm a poet, but I slowly started writing poems, but then the poems were really dark, right? But I feel like it was a way that I was starting to process what I was experiencing. And because I'm a political person and a historian and and a journalist, and so I pay attention to the news, I felt like at one point I was consuming too much information and it just bogged me down, right, to a point of just stagnation. And I don't remember exactly what I did to get out of that other than probably stop consuming consuming a little less news, but it's tough because I'm a journalist too. But I know for me personally, it was for a minute, it was just I couldn't do anything at all. And I'm sure I'm not alone in that at all. So I don't know. Anyway, so you brought up Dr. Sharma, you brought up generational trauma, and I want to segue into the massacre. But before we get to the massacre, I'm going to share something about generational trauma that you both sort of alluded to earlier, particularly when we're talking about North Tulsa or neighborhoods like North Tulsa, Northeast Oklahoma City, West Tulsa, parts of East Tulsa, South side of Chicago, where I spent almost 30 years, which is where this story sort of is situated, right? And so, like I said, I lived for 30 years in Chicago, most of those on the South side, working in K-12 education as well as higher education. And I was telling my students in a class last night that I taught at one school on the West Side a fifth generation gangster, right? So I was teaching in a K through eighth. So I was working with the seventh and eighth graders. And, many of the eighth grade boys, it was a gang riddled community, gang turf community. And I was working with young men who made no bones to hide from me or really from any other adult that they were squad, right? They were gang. And then when I was able to talk to them or get them writing, which was part of what I was there to do, I learned that, daddy was a gangster, granddaddy was a gangster, great granddaddy was a gangster, and I likened it to how some people are raised in their faith, right? If your grandma went to church, then, if your great grandma took grandma to church and grandma took your mom to church and then mom took you to church, that's 5 generations or 4 generations of churchgoers. Flip that to thinking about gang life, and the contemporary or modern gang culture in this country is at least 50 years old, right? At least 50 years old. And so I think about that in terms of not only gang culture in Chicago or gang culture in Tulsa, but thinking about that in terms of how generational trauma can be, I don't know, products can be born of an environment, perhaps, in addition to perhaps something larger than that, like the massacre. Does that make sense at all?
Yeah. It makes me think, like, if that's all you know, then that's all you know. That's what you do. So if you don't know anything outside of that, you're not exposed to other ways of doing things. And so yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah. And it also makes sense on a very neurobiological, like genetic level, not just with like the genes that are passed through generations to generation, but also the patterns of behavior that are developed. They also pass through, and there is some research out there that talks about the fact that how we actually have mirror neurons in our brain, and we learn through imitation. So if that is all we have seen, then that is all we think is the way to live life, basically. So if I like you said, I've worked with a lot of people, and a lot of people have actually seen, a lot of perpetrators actually talk about this and talk about their own personal trauma in their lives. Like, I was abused in this way, a very specific way. And so that's how I thought that I expressed my love for other people, because that person told me that they loved me, but then they hurt me. So now that is what I learned, because that is what I saw. So now I'm going to hurt people because I love them. Right. And that's what I have, because no one has taught me any different. And so when you work with them, and when they come to find out, like, oh, there's actually a different way to do this, like, no, you actually don't hurt people that you love.
Yeah.
This is how you love people that you love. Then they're like, oh, well, no one told me that, because this is what I saw. So how was I supposed to know that? And a lot of times you will see that in perpetrators, and and I'm specifically talking about perpetrators, but I'm sure that is something that can be transitioned to understand other kinds of generational things that are habits or beliefs or attitudes that pass from one generation to the other
Those are picked up early on. I'm sorry, I cut you off.
Yeah.
I worked in early childhood as well, and kids will tell your business through play. So if you're playing with dolls and they're fighting a lot, or and if this is like 3, 4, and 5-year-olds, that's telling of a child, and that's how they're expressing themselves. And so coming up with healthy habits or healthy coping mechanisms for young kids is important, because if we don't stop it when they're young, they grow up thinking, again, this is how I express love. This is how I'm supposed to handle this situation. So if you don't catch it early, they pick up on it. They're sponges, and they continue to be spongy even up until, adulthood, because again, and if you love, that's your family, your base unit. So you don't want to be separated from them. So a lot of times you're going to do what the family does, because that's who you love. That's who you know.
Yeah. And as human beings, we're wired to be social. So we're community-based animals, right? We're people who cannot thrive in isolation. So I think, that in order to maintain that connection, a lot of times some people, even when they realize that this is probably not the best thing to do, they will still sacrifice that kind of like a higher level, sort of like thinking of like a more sort of a critical thinking lens. They will sacrifice that lens to be like, well, but if I don't do this, then I lose this connection, and I want this connection, and I need this connection to survive. So I'm going to sacrifice this critical thinking that I'm having, or the questioning that I'm having, to say like, this is not the right thing to do, or whatever, in order to continue to maintain that connection with somebody. And you see that in family systems, you see that across generations, you see that in close-knit societies also, who have been establishing culture for many, many, many years and many generations, that it is really hard to break free from that, to say like, I lose all of this just because of one decision that I want to live my life a certain way.
And you see that in gang culture too, right? I've seen that, again, in my 30 years in Chicago. That the gang becomes a family unit, right? It's it serves in a way to as surrogate parents in many ways, because you have rules, and there are elders, and there are OGs who are who are treating you like, like children, or, like sons or nephews. So there's a family structure there in the midst of the business, if you will, in which they are engaged. But to lose that, particularly depending on your neighborhood, depending on the block, young men and young women, if you're not gang, you're nothing, right? And so
You don't belong.
you don't belong, right? And so you are put aside, you're cast out. And that has to be, whether we're talking about gang or perpetuating some kind of violence, learned violence, that's got to be a hard cycle to unlearn, right? So then how does that, or does it differ at all from the generational trauma of significant events, like, major political, I should say, all these events are significant. So let me not put any sort of, weight on either, but on something like the massacre, something like the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, where we are, again, in 2 weeks, we will observe the centennial of the destruction of 36 to 40 blocks, of over 600 Black-owned businesses and homes, over 1,600 homes, 600 businesses, churches, schools, banks, law offices, theaters, and no survivor. We have 3 survivors still with us, ashe, and we have, thousands of descendants. And no one has ever received a dime in reparations or reparations of any kind for the loss of generational wealth, in addition to the generational trauma, which I feel like, and again, my specialty is Africana studies and creative writing. So I'm going to leave this to you two science heads. But to me, there seems like there has to be some sort of, those things kind of feed one another in some way, right? What do you think?
Yeah. Okay. So when I think about the massacre, there are different ages. You had children up to adults. Okay. Children had their own experience. Everyone had their own experiences. But from what I understand, a lot of people didn't talk about it. And so people move on, like, okay, this happened, but we're not going to talk about it. But I'm feeling this way. And this kid is over here feeling the way too, but we're not going to talk about it. So that's where the generational come in. And so, and if you have, anger builds up and behaviors show themselves differently with emotions. So throughout the generations, that's going to happen. And then if no one show that they cared by reparations or, giving you, who am I then? And so that's another layer of trauma because, okay, you destroyed my entire community and now I have nothing. And who cares about me now? So do I even care? This is just me thinking, if I was back, would I care about myself? And then what kind of life would that lead to if no one cares? We're supposed to be, you have a community, many people experience it together, but many people experience the same thing and the help wasn't there. What would be the expectation? What is the outcome of healing? And if people don't heal. So it wasn't dealt with. So we're still reaping the repercussions 100 years later, because there's a book, The Body Keeps Score. I forget the author, but even from childhood, I even think even back to conception, if a mother is stressed, that baby feels that stress too. That baby comes out into the world stressed. So if a mother was pregnant and the mother's experienced this, that automatically is leading to the next generation feeling stressed and already out of place with. So yeah.
And I totally agree. And I'm gonna discuss this in 2 parts. So first, Chantel just gave a really perfect example of how people make meaning of a certain trauma and how they move forward in life. When a trauma happens, there is always a pre-self and a post-self, and the post-self involves is involved in meaning making, and it's involved in developing a narrative or developing a story about their own life as a result of that trauma. So when that trauma happens and we make a certain kind of meaning from it, that meaning is going to carry with us. And that meaning is also going to result in certain habits and certain learning. Like Chantal was saying, like the silencing. Silencing is a big result of trauma. It's like not talking about it, but it still manifests. It's manifesting in your system. It's manifesting in your behaviors. It's manifesting in your social emotional health. So you're passing all of that to your offspring. And you're also passing all of that silence to your offspring too, because no one's talking about it. So now a person might feel anxious, or a person might feel a certain thing, or a person might feel scared of someone as a child, and no one is able to understand why. But we can understand why, because we're passing this through ourselves to our younger generations. There's a really interesting research related to the Dutch famine that happened, years and years ago. And what they did was they tried to interview people and look at health issues that people had developed when the Dutch famine was going on and mothers were pregnant. So they actually talked to the people who were the kids of those mothers who were surviving during that famine. And they saw a high rate of health issues in those populations. So there's a handful of people that they could find, and also the results were so interesting because there was high blood pressure, diabetes, and we talk about this also with adverse childhood experiences. It's like health issues develop in the future as a result of trauma during childhood. So if specifically with any kind of community violence or any kind of community trauma or trauma that happens not only within a family system, but also on a community level, all those families are not only dealing with it on a community level, but they're also dealing with it on an individual level. So the systems of transference are pretty much the same. We're making meaning and we're developing stories, and those stories are being either passed down as unhealthy coping mechanisms or as problems to cope with emotions or highly emotional states. And if that is, that's something that we don't talk about, then that is also going to transfer from one generation to another.
And as you were talking about community, I was thinking, piecing together different things. There was a special on, I forget what news station, but it talked about like kids, maybe this webinar I attended, it talked about kids returning back to school after the pandemic, but also the social injustice that occurred around George Floyd. And so you go in and it's like, okay, all of this happened, but we're not going to talk about it. Okay, that's a lot to deal with. So if we're talking about a city being bombed and everything, but no one's going to deal with, like, how do you expect generations later to respond and to come out in a positive manner if there were no resources? I mean, what is the expected outcome? And so when we're thinking about the pandemic and the massacre, just making sure that healthy conversations do need to be had, and it's okay to have those conversations. And if you don't feel that you could talk about those things, find somebody who can. I think the important thing is to want to be able to express yourself, but also to have the knowledge, because that the silence that goes on in families, that's detrimental to our entire world, because quite honestly, it happens throughout everybody. I'm pretty sure every family has some things we don't talk about, but a lot of times that it becomes detrimental because there are some health issues that we could be addressing. There are some mental health issues, particularly, that we could be addressing. We don't have to say, oh, that's just how they are. Well, is it, or can they be helped? Can this be helped?
Exactly. Yeah.
How is, maybe you address this and this isn't a factor, or it doesn't add a particular element, but it seems to me like it might. So the Black folks who stayed in Tulsa after the massacre, because many fled, hundreds were killed, but the Black folks who stayed were warned by white people not to speak of this, and actually warned if they spoke of it, it could happen again, which is a part of the reason why Black folks didn't speak of it, right? Does that add any sort of extra to the weight of the silencing, as you two put it?
Yeah, because then the Black people continue to be oppressed. Now you're telling me, okay, this happened to me, but I'm not supposed to talk about it. So if I can't talk about it, well, then how do I deal with this? And if I do talk about it, this is going to happen. So you're put in a lose-lose situation. And if anyone who's been in a lose-lose situation, I don't see how you keep a smile on your face. I don't see how it's very challenging to come out of those situations. So yes, it definitely puts a whole nother layer. That's another trauma, because no one wants to be enslaved in any type of way. And that's a form of enslavement when we can't talk about it.
I think we've seen this throughout various community violence situations, even with the Holocaust, people who left and came to different or went to different countries, they sometimes within family systems decided that they were never going to talk about it. And that actually led to more trauma within those certain family systems, because there was that silencing. People who actually, now here's a little bit of a flip side, but people who actually lived in those communities, sometimes because they had the community and because they could talk within their community, the healing happened in that community in a way that it didn't happen for the people who left the community. So it's really interesting that you say that, is like, because I think it would definitely add another layer to the complication, that if people actually stayed in this community, also didn't talk within the community, that healing definitely did not happen. So maybe they were similar to people who left and decided that they weren't going to talk about it either. So that silencing definitely has a effect on people, that it's almost like not being able to develop your narrative. It's almost like not being able to put meaning or put words to what you've been through. So you're just going to hold it, right? And, like Chantal said, body keeps the score. Bessel van der Kolk talks about it. And a lot of other people have talked about it in the past as well. It's like, your body will hold all of this trauma unless you find a way to release it somehow. There's a really cool example that someone told me, in a dance and movement class, actually. And they said that if you ever observe and look at a fawn who's running away from a cheetah, you will see that all the adrenaline that it gathers in order to run away from the cheetah, it actually releases that adrenaline by shaking its body after it's gotten away. And that's the fawn's way to get rid of all that adrenaline and all that energy and process all that trauma, that fight or flight that they were experiencing while they were trying to run away from the cheetah. But if you can't do that, then you're holding it and it's going to continue to manifest.
And I think as you were talking, Dr. Sharma, I thought about how maybe the people who fled, but in regards to people not dealing with it, it resurfaces later. Like, and you have to be able to acknowledge that because of course people put things out of their mind a lot of times, but especially, and if you were in this pandemic and you had time to think, some thoughts from the past definitely probably came up because, you have that time. And so, we can't run away from it. I mean, we can run away from our situations, but we still have to deal with it, even if we're in a new situation, because again, it's going to resurface at some point in our life.
What's interesting about what you two just said too, again, from the historian side, which is where I come from, is that the folks who stayed, fought, led by B.C. Franklin, fought the city, who made it very challenging for them to rebuild, wanted to make it impossible for them to rebuild, and actually 200 businesses were back up with it by 1922, within a year, right? And the churches, Mount Zion, Vernon AME in particular, served as sort of the hubs and the homes. They had to be rebuilt too, but served as the homes and the hubs for this activity, in part with some folks living in tents, some folks living in wooden shacks that the Red Cross provided up and down Greenwood. But those who stayed actually rebuilt a significant part of the community by 1922. And it makes me think about what you just said about sort of the group dynamic of staying in place, and then although, they saw many of their fellow community members shot down in the street, they saw their homes and their businesses burned to the ground, right? And many of them themselves were marched to one of 3 internment camps and were interned indefinitely, sometimes for up to 6 days or more, right? Unless you worked for a white person who could come and claim you, right, to get you out of this prison. And then still had the resilience to rebuild. And I think about that in the context of what you all just said, what you both just said, in relationship to the folks who fled and were able, thankfully, were able to get away, but then were left sort of isolated from the community and isolated in their trauma. Is that am I hearing what you're saying correctly there?
Yes. I think, yes, leaving and not talking about something would be then, if you're not talking to your community or getting support from your community, that would be being silenced within that trauma and holding it on an individual level instead of being able to share it. And I think that one of the things that you are talking about kind of reminds me of one of the basics of trauma that we talk about is that everyone reacts differently. So there might be some people who might react in a very different way by rebuilding. We saw that as a result of Katrina. When Katrina happened, people started rebuilding and they became stronger. We see that as a result of any kind of attacks on a city. We saw that in New York. We saw that in Boston. So sometimes people channel that into building and rebuilding, and that's how they cope. And some people, will kind of hold it and close up and, put their guards up. So it really depends on the way in which you have learned coping through your family system and through your community and how you are going to react to a particular trauma. A lot of that depends on that base that people have built as children.
Completely agree. And I wanted to add, there was a comment from Facebook tying into that, like back in the days, a lot of topics were silenced due to shame and denial. But when you compound that with the massacre or other tragic events, that just becomes overbearing for many people, because yes, a lot of families are dealing with a lot of the same trauma, different types of abuses, that happens across the board around the world. But then there are certain groups of people who are specifically targeted too, which adds another layer onto what the things that they're already dealing with. So yes, there really are no words to describe the horror that occurred. But I think as a people, as a world, we have to get comfortable with talking about those uncomfortable things, because we continue these generations, and even within family units, we're not going to talk about that. Well, that stuff resurfaces again years later. So, and the internet is out there, people can find information, but just in general, we have to get used to talking about some things, because it can heal us. We can be healed when we talk about these things, even if they're uncomfortable.
Exactly. And I totally agree with that. And because not talking about it is going to lead to very minimal healing, because a person cannot heal unless you have the awareness to and the willingness to be able to process something in order to heal, and then also the community to support that. We see that a lot of times, when we're talking about PTSD, there is a huge focus on talking about PTSD and trauma and undesirable effects of trauma. And also there is a whole other side of that research, which is growth. Sometimes you'll see people undergo horrible traumas and emerge from that and shoot forward and thrive in a way that no one ever imagined, that they themselves even didn't imagine that they were going to be able to do. So I think we need to be able to cultivate that hope to say trauma isn't the end here. Trauma can be the beginning of other beautiful things as well. And trauma and desirable effects of trauma and undesirable effects of trauma can both exist on the same plane. It's a dichotomy. It doesn't have to be either or. Both can be run parallel to each other. I can have some reactions to past trauma that I react to and become like super upset, and also at the same time progress my life and channel my life in a way that's going to lead me to thrive and grow. So both things are possible.
And I'm still, you mentioned New York. I was living in New York when the attacks on September 11th occurred. I actually thought I was going to die in them. That's how close I was to the towers. And that's still, it took me 10 years before I could even look at video of that day, without really sort of cringing and being in kind of moving into a sort of fetal position. And I don't know that I'm completely healed from that yet. We're so many years removed from it now. So understanding how the body keeps score, which is a fascinating phrase. I'm going to have to pick up this book. So lastly, before we wrap up, is there anything that either of you would like to sort of add, whether it's about the pandemic or whether it's about the massacre or about something else related to how we best cope and possibly even thrive in this crazy bananas moment that we are in? Dr. Sharman, why don't you go first?
Sure. I would say staying open to having conversations, and staying open to and willing to have conversations about not just emotions, but also, what you're thinking, what you're feeling during that time, your thoughts related to the exhaustion that you're experiencing. A lot of times, a lot of grief can also desensitize us to be able to say, like, I don't feel anything, and being able to accept that you feel numb for a while. And it's going to get better. And also along with that, you will only have capacity to be able to do that when you find ways in which you can fill your own bucket. So a lot of these things that we're talking about today, having the capacity, keeping your heart open, being hopeful, all those things require a lot of energy. So finding ways and things that is going to fill your bucket, because these things are definitely going to take some stuff away from your bucket, and that energy and that resource that you have, that life power that you have and holds within yourself. So figuring out ways in which that can be filled as well. What is giving you energy? Is it friends? Is it family? Is it food? Is it exercise? Is it being outside, going for a walk, horticulture, planting trees? What is it that fills your bucket? And being aware of that and doing all those things, and of course, healthy ways to do things and fill your bucket, and then being able to also at the same time maintain that openness to have conversations and difficult conversations.
Completely agree with everything. I would add, I'm gonna start by saying, like, a couple of days ago, I realized I had taken on too much. And so before just like completely losing it, just realizing, okay, this is a point where you're not feeling your best. So stop, and then take a break or take a rest. So I just went to bed early that night. And so realizing that, you have your limits. Everyone has limits. And so when we're thinking about trauma, everyone's going to experience some type of trauma in their life, but we all have limits. And when when we get to a certain capacity in our limits, reach out for help. Don't be afraid. Know that you are not alone. Again, Dr. Sharma mentioned that we're built to socialize with other people. We're not built for isolation. So you don't have to go through your trauma in isolation. Believe it or not, other people probably have been through the same thing. Not that you have to go and seek them, but just know that you are not alone, and that there's help out there.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Chantel. Thank you, Dr. Sharma. There's one comment I want to bring up, and then we actually probably need to wrap up. A comment came in via the chat. It's an interesting question for you too. I wonder if in lauding the resilience of the survivors of the Tulsa Race Massacre, we lose sight of the fact that they are traumatized. It sometimes feels like an all or nothing conversation, like they can't be brave and resilient, but also traumatized and in pain. I wonder what language we can use to help with that complex understanding. You two have any ideas about what language we could use there?
Brave and resilient, traumatized and in pain. And we have multiple layers as human beings. And so it's okay to use whatever we're feeling. Yes, they were survivors, but they were traumatized too. But I would say they were survivors first who were traumatized. I would use that language.
Yeah. And I would say, like, a lot of times we do this in my profession is to not try to think of things as like this comment says, like all or nothing, so a lot of times if we replace things with replace the word but with and, it makes a really big difference. I am traumatized and I am rebuilding my community. I went through this horrific thing and I was able to do this as well. So being able to add that, because a lot of times the words very simple words that we use can, and I also kind of get the feeling from this comment that they're also alluding to some kind of toxic positivity sometimes that we develop, is to say, like, let's just talk about the desirable and not talk about that undesirable. But the thing is, and the fact of the matter is that we're human beings, and human beings are messy, and human beings can be dichotomous. They can be sad and happy at the same time. They can be cheerful and depressed at the same time. So we really need to try to think of human emotion and being human in that way, to say, like, it is okay to hold those dichotomies between within ourselves, and also provide that grace and compassion to other people, to say, you're also complex as I am. So let's accept that, and having that willingness to accept.